Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bharti and welcome to another episode of TFR Insights. And today we have with us Chris Grams, Head of Marketing at Tidelift. Chris, it's good to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me here. It's great to be here.
Uh, Tell us a bit about Tidelift. What does the company do?
So, Tidelift has been working on a problem that is near and dear to my heart. I've been part of the open source software community for over 20 years, and one of the things that we've seen, I was previously at Red Hat, and at Red Hat, one of the things that we were doing is we were trying to solve a problem where big companies who were using open source didn't have anyone standing behind that software. And so Red Hat, got bigger by creating Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and all of a sudden companies had a way to be able to go to somebody and say, this company is going to make promises about the future of that software. But for the vast majority of components, open source components people use to build applications, like in JavaScript, Java, Python, et cetera, there's no company you can go to. It's a bunch of individual open source maintainers who are working on this software, oftentimes without getting paid for it. So what Tidelift does is Tidelift works with the maintainers of the open source software that application developers are using every day to provide a set of assurances around that software and to provide a set of tools that help people manage their open source better so that they can actually use it safely and ensure that it's well maintained and all of that sort of stuff rather than relying on a group of maintainers that may or may not have motivation to keep their software up to date and secure.
Looking at today's world, when open source is used, because everybody is using open source, most of people don't even realize it. They're running some containers and they don't know that it's open source code in that container. So talk a bit about the increase of open source that you are witnessing, because you also do a survey. I want to talk about the survey. But before that, I just want to understand from you what kind of trends you are seeing in terms of increasing adoption of open source itself.
Well, we've been doing this survey for about 3 years now. And 2 years ago, we asked that very question. Does your company use open source to develop applications? And we found that 92% of companies are actually using open source to develop applications. So open source is really ubiquitous. It's basically the modern development platform now. And the reasons, there's many reasons, well-known, well-documented reasons why people use open source. But as you pointed out, there is a little bit of a free puppy problem with open source where people go to open source because of the perceived cost savings, that they want to save money, have free things that they can download off the internet and put into their code. But just like when you get a free puppy, then there's all sorts of costs of buying food and ensuring there's somebody who can take it out 3 or 4 times a day and all that sort of stuff you have to deal with. Open source is the same way, where it has to be maintained. You have to keep it up to date and keep it secure. And so that's why Tidelift has sort of built this business around what we call managed open source, which is essentially doing all that work like that you would do for the puppy. We take care of that for organizations so that they no longer have to have their developers spending time doing all of that sort of routine maintenance work. And instead can focus on the things that are truly differentiating for their business.
When you mentioned puppy example, if you look at today's cloud stack, or if you look at CNCF's landscape, you have to use so many different components. It's hard to find a developer who is specialized all the way from HTO to Ingrid. There's so much to do, so you cannot have an in-house developer who expertises in all those open source technologies there. So it's not just puppy. You have puppy, a cat, a dog, a horse, and an elephant there.
Yeah, absolutely. You're so right about that.
So while you are doing the survey, why do you want to know the state of open source in a way, the adoption and usage? Of course, it does play into your business, but how does it also help open source ecosystem and community as well?
Yeah, the big reason we've been doing this survey is because, like you said, we need to answer some of these questions for, to understand what our customers' pains are. We really want to understand deeply for application developers, what are they worried about? What are their pains? What are their hopes and dreams and all that sort of stuff, their aspirations, so we can build a better solution for them. But at the same time, like we learn so much interesting stuff. Like, why keep it to ourselves? So that's why we put out this survey report. Is we do this survey every year, and then we just learn stuff that we think is really useful to a lot of people, especially if you want to understand what other application developers like you are dealing with in their organizations. We've sort of rounded up a group of 600 top developers who are doing things with open source at work, and ask them questions, and hopefully other folks can learn from the sort of best practices of their colleagues.
We are going through this crisis because a lot of companies are suddenly looking at cloud, as an urgency. They should be on the cloud or digital transformation back yesterday, but they are moving there. Did you see any increase in adoption of open source because of this pandemic as well?
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things we wanted to test in the survey. Is we had this theory going into this year's survey, which was that in every recession that we've seen since the first recession where open source was around in the early 2000s, is that open source usage tends to increase in recessions. Certainly my firsthand experience being at Red Hat was when the enterprise Linux business really took off, was in 2001, 2002, when we were going through the dot-com bust, and then all of a sudden people were looking for ways to save money. And so they switched over and started using Red Hat Enterprise Linux in that case, because they were trying to get rid of all the x86 hardware. I mean, they were trying to start using x86 hardware instead of things like Sun Solaris that were super expensive. It was essentially a cost savings thing. But once they had open source in place, they started to get some of the other benefits of open source too, and they never went back, even when the economy came back. Well, as you talked about with cloud a couple of minutes ago, we saw the same thing happen in 2008 in the financial crisis. Organizations, again, looking to cut costs. Where can they go? They start moving workloads over to the cloud. They start using more open source on the cloud. And we had this theory that the same thing might be happening here in this COVID-induced recession. In fact, we found that to be true. So in our survey, we found that basically almost no organization was going to use less open source in this downturn, and 44% of organizations were likely to use even more open source in this downturn. So almost half of organizations were going to increase their open source usage, and over 40% of organizations were seeing budget cuts too. So only 10% of organizations were seeing their budgets go up. Most organizations were seeing their budgets go down. And almost half of organizations were reporting that they were likely to use more open source. So that did sort of validate what we were expecting to see, which is that, again, people are looking for that first set of benefits, the cost savings benefit, and then they got to deal with the free puppy after that, right? They get more open source in, and then they have to figure out how to ensure it's supported and maintained.
Do you think that it's just purely cost saving, or also that because of these crises or recession, they are in an uncomfortable zone where they have to innovate because their budgets are being cut? So the solutions or things they were not looking when they were comfortable, suddenly they are looking at it, and then they become more innovative, more creative, and then suddenly they're like, so what are the factors that play a big role in adoption of open source? Generally, it's people look at cost saving, but over time, open source does become as expensive as any other proprietary software. But the advantage you get is you can move so much faster with open source versus waiting for a monolith releases by releases. Second is you can get also involved with the. I mean, you don't have to wait for patches. Your developer can go in and patch it yourself. So you can keep your stack secure. You can also build your own distinctive edge against your competitor, because even if everybody's using the same stack, you can just plug in whatever you want. So talk about some of the factors where during these pandemics, people tend to lean towards open source.
Yeah, so it's funny. We actually asked exactly that question: why are organizations more likely to use more open source during this COVID-related recession? And what we found is pretty much exactly the reasons why you said. The number one reason is obviously saving money and development time, because you're reusing code that's already been written versus having to write it from scratch. But one thing that was really interesting that we found is that in organizations with more than 1,000 employees, almost double the amount of organizations said that they're using open source to increase the efficiency of their application development. So exactly what you said is that these organizations cannot slow down just because their budgets are being cut, because revenues are being cut. The competition is too high. So they look to open source as a way to continue to innovate quickly and to not have to slow down their speed of innovation, just because their budgets are smaller. So when times are tight, people turn to open source because it allows them to innovate, especially big companies, where maybe they had broader budgets where they could bring in proprietary tools or other things before. When in a time like this, it's even more important for them to get the most bang for their buck, and open source helps them do that.
One more thing with open source is that as rosy the picture looked like, it is not. There are a lot of challenges that you cannot just download it, install it, and you're all set to go. So there are a lot of challenges that come there. So what kind of challenges that you often see companies come across when they embrace or adopt open source technologies?
Yeah, and again, this is a question that we asked this year in the survey. We wanted to see what are the most common challenges organizations face when using open source, and the most common thing is making good decisions about what components and versions of components to use. 61% of people overall reported that, and making good decisions about when to upgrade is the second most important thing after that. So people are looking for, they often, open source is a fire hose of new things coming out, new versions, and keeping up and understanding which versions you should be on and which versions interact with other versions in the right ways. Those are pretty important, of course. And then, especially for big companies, this was more common with big companies than with the survey sample as a whole, but 58% of companies with more than 10,000 employees said that identifying and resolving security vulnerabilities was one of the big challenges. And then other things that are important that we see all the time are things like licensing issues. Again, that's a big company issue. Smaller organizations don't really care. They just sort of YOLO and use whatever open source they find. But bigger companies that are dealing with these sort of potential big consequences if they improperly use a piece of open source software really care about ensuring that they're able to comply with the license terms, that they understand what they're agreeing to in terms of the license that the open source they use is under.
So we have talked about consuming open source. What about using open source? The difference is you consume, you don't care where it is coming from. When you become user, you also become a contributor. So do you think that companies do realize that it's also a good idea to be a good open source citizen where you contribute back? I mean, you don't have to. If you don't make any, like Linus Torvalds says, if you don't make any changes, you don't have to contribute back. But still, what have you seen there through this survey?
Yeah, we find in the survey we found that almost half of organizations have some way that they're contributing, that they have a policy, an actual policy around contributing to open source. And it's everything from the most common things are that employee time is allocated for contributing to projects. That's what we see. That's the most obvious thing, is that and sometimes it's projects that the company is actually using. That's the most common thing, is that you obviously would spend time making a project better that your organization is using. But some organizations also allow employee time for projects that the company isn't using, that they're just becoming, essentially their employees are good open source citizens, which is great to see. Another thing that's pretty common is releasing the organization's intellectual property as open source. 39% of folks reported that. And then less common is, sadly, financially supporting the open source projects in some way. Only 15% of organizations say they provide financial support via foundation, consortium, or other entity, and only 12% that said they actually finance an individual open source maintainer in some way. And again, that's part of the problem that we're hoping to solve at Tidelift, is figuring out, by selling people a subscription to a well-maintained version of the open source that they're using, it's an easy way to actually contribute to those maintainers and have them get financially compensated for their work, well, you're getting value in return. I think one of the reasons why more organizations don't financially contribute to maintainers is there's no value swap equation there. You don't get any, sort of like SLA like you would with a commercial organization or set of assurances that you're paying for. It's almost like a donation to an open source maintainer or to an organization. And for a lot of organizations, that just doesn't make sense. For procurement folks who are having to foot the bill for that, is, wait, I'm paying for what? I'm just, I'm donating money to something. They don't understand that, versus if they can actually buy a product or buy a service that fits more within the way most organizations operate. So hopefully that will be the model of the future, is ways to actually fund this important open source maintenance work by creating commercial models for it, much as we have in other companies in the open source world that have commercialized different parts of open source. We're essentially trying to do that for the application development space.
Right. One thing that I have heard a lot from folks when I talk to, sometimes like Greg or Linus, they will once again say that I want selfish users who are invested in open source for selfish reasons. The reason is that when you look at open source as donation or charity, the moment you are not that charitable or your funds are drying up, you will pull out. So there is no sustainability, because your success is not tied to the success of that project. You are just throwing away whatever extra dollars you have. So it's better to have a business model as you are building there, which builds a very sustainable future for those open source projects that are being used. One more thing is that according to Linux Foundation survey, now more and more developers who are working on open source code base are on payrolls of companies. The number of people working in their basement in the free time is shrinking. I think they are relegated to some of those projects like desktop Linux, which is still a hobby project, not, of course, Linux servers run, Red Hat Linux is there, SUSE Linux, but I'm talking about the consumer side. So have you also seen anything where how many developers are getting paid versus how many are volunteering, because that also affects the sustainability of open source?
Yeah, and I don't know the background details on the sample from the Linux Foundation report, but I certainly know that in the infrastructure space, things are a lot more, I would say, established than they are in the application development tool space. So like where we focus is we focus on all of your application development languages like JavaScript, Java, Python, PHP, and it's still the Wild West in a lot of those. You have a lot of independent open source maintainers who are working a day job unrelated to what they're doing, and this is a hobby night and weekend sort of thing. So I think there are certain segments of the open source world, especially the ones that like that we're all familiar with, like on the enterprise infrastructure side, that are much further along, and many of those maintainers do work for the big companies. But the other thing that I would point out is that's not always the life that everyone wants to choose. Like not every maintainer's dream is going and working for a big corporation. And shouldn't there be options where maintainers, like it shouldn't be the only possible winning scenario for an open source maintainer that they accept a job, for a certain salary working for a big company? What if they could instead become a millionaire or even a billionaire in the way that many of these unicorn companies that are using the software they make are becoming? What if they could do that and stay independent and stay on their own and actually benefit from all of the work that they've done at scale versus just at a getting a salary from a company level? And that's something that we're super excited about, and we see as a possibility of the sort of billionaire open source maintainer of the future who does a project that so many people are out there using and actually sees benefit from it.
No, I can see your point, and I fully agree with you. I know so many. I know so many. When I look at the community, I met the people. Those people, oh, last year you were at X company. Before that, you were at Y company. So they keep changing companies, but they continue to work on the same projects. So yeah, you're right. They are committed to that project. They are not doing it for paycheck. So it's very good to have a business model where they don't have to have a separate day job, where their job and their passion becomes same. I want to just, if you can take a moment to just talk about how does the Tidelift model works? How does it help these individual developers?
Yeah, so basically, I can describe it from both sides of the equation. If you are an open source maintainer, what you would do is you essentially join as what we call a lifter. You become a lifter behind the Tidelift subscription for your package. And what you would do is you'd actually go to the Tidelift website and you can look and see there is already money in place from subscribers that have paid into the system, where they can go and they can actually see how much money they could be making right now if they were to provide a set of assurances as part of the Tidelift subscription. And the things that we ask them to do are the sort of things that we've learned over the last 20 years that big companies care about when it comes to open source. So they're basically making sure that they're keeping the project maintained. They're validating the license that they put it under. They're doing the normal security related things and coming up with a process for in case there are security issues. So that's what the maintainers do. And in return for doing that work and agreeing to continue to do that work into the future, we pay them based on the subscribers that we have that are using their particular project. So, if there's 100 people using, X open source project, that maintainer will make more money than if 10 people are using X project. Now, on the subscriber side, the way it works is you basically come to Tidelift and you get one subscription that covers all of the open source dependencies you're using to build your applications. And it's our job to go find the maintainers to do that work, to do all of the security maintenance and licensing work. And then the other thing that we do, and this is brand new, is that we create a way for you to essentially have a catalog of open source packages that you can create and manage, much in the same way that the biggest companies like Google and Amazon, you may have heard of Google has a mono repo, which is basically their one thing with all the open source packages that are approved for use in the organization. Now we have a similar way where up until recently, it was almost impossible for most companies to do what Google does, to create that big mono repo, because it takes a lot of time for people to go and keep all those things up to date and ensure they're using versions that work together. But now Tidelift provides a way for any organization to create their own essentially catalog of approved open source packages, and then developers across the organization can go to that, so they're not constantly asking the question, is it okay if I use this package, or getting caught up in a bureaucracy of waiting 2 months to get approval to use a particular open source component. We make it much easier for them to do that. So it's that combination of the maintainers on one side who are actually backing up the Tidelift subscription, and then on the other side, it's customers who are getting value from the maintainers' work, who are paying in money that goes out to those maintainers so that they can actually continue to keep their projects working into the future.
In early day, it was like, don't fix it if it's not broken. With this whole DevOps open source, you can move really fast. But moving fast also means breaking things. Yes, you break things frequently, but you also fix them frequently. So how do you help companies maintain this balance between staying safe while also moving fast? Though I don't think that sometimes moving fast can also keep you safe, because from security perspective, you can keep moving there. So talk about it, because a lot of projects, some projects have LTS version, long-term support version, some projects just have waterfall models, some projects have, So talk about how do you help companies maintain their own pace while leveraging these open source technologies, which are moving at their own pace.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the toughest things that organizations have to figure out. As we typically see, there's sort of two extremes that organizations fall. One side is, like you said, it's sort of moving fast, where they're just like, again, YOLO, bring in whatever open source components any individual developer wants to use. They just use it and they hope for the best. And that approach tends to work for small organizations or organizations that don't have tons of customer data or things like that. But there is no way that approach works if you're working in a large regulated industry. You have lots of important customer data. And so companies in that space tend to go to the other extreme, where they set up almost like a bureaucratic approval process, and you have to do scanning tools to make sure there's no security and licensing. And basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a happy middle where organizations can take advantage of the innovative speed that open source is moving, and they can have sort of an automated, like a catalog of the best of the moment packages that they can use for their applications, but cut down on sort of that bureaucracy layer so that you're like approving packages once. You're creating this catalog once that the entire organization can use, and then developers can just, as long as they're staying on that paved path and using those packages that are already approved, they're golden. Right. But as soon as they go off the paved path, some organizations may be like, you can't do that. You can't use those packages. And some organizations might be like, hey, I just want you to know that you're off the paved path and you're taking risks, so you have to do extra things. So organizations can choose where they want to be on that. And some organizations are going to be able to take more risks than others. But the reality is, very few organizations should just be, doing the move fast without any element of staying safe. I mean, it's really, really risky to use open source in that way. And I think the only reason organizations do that is because it has been difficult to do this sort of make these sort of open source policies and create a catalog of packages that anyone can use and do that at a scale. It's just a hard problem to solve. And it's something that we've seen for a while. And that's why we're trying to solve it.
Chris, thank you so much for taking your time out today and talk about not only this survey, but also how companies are using open source and how you are helping the ecosystem where developers play a very big role to keep the ecosystem sustainable. So once again, thank you. And I look forward to talk to you again.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.